Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ballot Measures as a Tool for Change, where we'll be hearing directly from state leaders who are leveraging the people's tool to move bold, progressive policies and building sustainable grassroots power in their states. I'm Marsha Donay. I'm the Capacity Building Director at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Theeda, would you like to introduce yourself really quick?
Yes, my name is Theeda Murphy, and I am the co-director of No Exceptions Prison Collective in Nashville, Tennessee, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, Dre. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, Dre Chiriboga-Flor. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the state director for 9 to 5 Colorado.
Awesome. Thank you both for being here today. Before we dive into this conversation, I did want to share for the audience a bit about the history of direct democracy in our country and how we got to the moment that we're in. So for folks who are not as familiar with ballot measures, they were created 120 years ago as a way for people to take back their democracy from the overreach and influence of corporations and special interests. Some of the first progressive ballot measures abolished poll taxes and funded universities. But even the people's tool was born into systems and structures designed to uphold white supremacy and systematic racism. And in an effort to further disenfranchise Black voters, legislators fought against enacting the ballot initiative process in the states with the most densely populated Black populations, mostly in the East and South. And a legacy we are still fighting today, and something Theeda will speak directly to from her work. So despite the early use of ballot measures as a tool for progressive change, conservatives did begin to leverage this tool to attack workers' rights, LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, environmental protections, and much more beginning in 1978. And this caused labor unions and the social justice movement to operate on the defense in order to protect our communities. So enter the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. We were founded over 20 years ago to advance a national progressive strategy for ballot measures. And we were created to work with state and national organizations around the country to return ballot measures back to being the people-powered tool for democracy that they are. And in 2010, this became even more important when 17 state legislatures were lost to conservative control, making ballot measures the only pathway for grassroots leaders to move policies that took care of their communities. And for the last 12 years, BISC has been working closely with grassroots leaders, national partners, and funders to move this proactive ballot measure strategy. We've now seen dozens of progressive victories at the ballot, even in very conservative states. Victories such as minimum wage and paid sick leave in Arizona, Medicaid expansion in Oklahoma, the removal of slavery from the state constitutions in Colorado, Utah, Nebraska, and many, many more. But of course, these victories have not gone unnoticed. As my colleagues Gina and Kentaya will talk about in the Protecting the People's Tool panel this afternoon, we are seeing efforts to restrict our ability to utilize this tool for progress. So if at the end of this panel, you are revved up and ready to go to the ballot with some bold progressive policies, I encourage you to check out that panel so you know what you're facing as you head into this next cycle. But for now, let's turn our attention to what is possible when we dream big on the ballot. Theeda and Dre, I am so happy to be joined by you today for this conversation. And so wanted to start off by giving you the opportunity to talk a bit about the policies that you all are moving or have moved and why you decided that a ballot measure was the path forward.
Okay, well, I guess I can go first. The measure that we have on the ballot is a constitutional amendment to remove the exception from slavery from the Tennessee State Constitution. And the reason we are doing this as a ballot measure is because that really is the only way to have a constitutional amendment in the state of Tennessee is to have a ballot measure.
So in 2020, 9 to 5, along with a lot of other grassroots organizations and labor unions, passed paid family and medical leave through the ballot. It's the first time that this type of program has been passed through the ballot before, and it really was after a 10-year fight. And so we had 6 attempts at the legislature to try to pass it. Our state became the blue trifecta in 2019. And that was the first time that our legislators were voting in a way that counted because it could actually pass. And unfortunately, we had some moderate Democrats who had voted yes on this before when we knew it wouldn't pass, get cold feet and pull out and push for, one of their strategies was pushing for privatization of the program, which of course means that private insurance companies could exploit and profit off of basic human and workers' rights. And so we pushed back really heavily, and finally, after a few attempts and just a lot of negotiations, we realized that we needed to put the power back into the hands of voters and pass it through a state ballot initiative, which obviously is more expensive, but it also was much more transformative in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and as Theeda talked about, like in Tennessee, going through the legislature is the only way to move an amendment forward, right? You don't have the citizen initiated process in your state. Dre, in Colorado, you do, but you did attempt to go through the legislature first. Can you talk a little bit about what that working within the legislature was like, and what, if any, compromises you had to make on the policies to be able to move them forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first few attempts, it really was almost like a public will building campaign, because we knew with a Republican majority in the Senate, we weren't going to pass it. But every year we pushed it a little bit farther along. So first year we didn't pass any committee. Second year we passed committee. Third year we got close to passing the one of the chambers, and so on and so forth. So we started to get closer, but also it became such a public issue that everyone was talking about it. Everyone could associate what paid family medical leave meant. And that was really a huge part of it, because we have to shift narrative and culture before we can pass policy, like most of the time, so that people understand this is a common sense issue. And so eventually, a lot of the conversations in terms of what people wanted to negotiate, or what, either moderate Dems or Republicans or the opposition wanted us to negotiate on, was privatizing parts of the program, was also changing the definition of family, so that it's not as inclusive of, like chosen family or folks that are not blood related. There is asked to compromise of just like who was included in the program, like for example, like small or local governments and things like that. So we were constantly asked to negotiate away our values, basically, and we know that some of these things, if we had compromise on, they would leave out the folks that are most impacted and need this program the most, which are women of color, single women who have children, folks who don't speak English, things like that. And so we were really determined to make this truly accessible, truly affordable for the folks who needed it the most. And that is also part of the reason why we had to go to the ballot, because we knew that if we kept going through the legislature, the only way it would pass is if we were willing to really compromise our values, and we weren't willing to do that, especially since we knew we were setting a precedent for other states.
Theeda, how about for you? How was that process of getting it through the legislature and developing the policy?
Well, we had to get because we are in a deeply red state with a legislature that is so so very Republican. So we had to, from the beginning, um, court Republican co-sponsors. Our primary sponsors were Democratic representative and a Democratic senator, but we had to court Republican sponsorship, which means that we had to go to the Tennessee Department of Corrections and get their support for this. Otherwise, it would never have gone through. So in order to do that, we had to add a clause about that specifically addresses that inmates can still be allowed to work. And even that was some back and forth because we had to edit that because they were going to continue to make work compulsory. And of course, that would negate everything that we were trying to do. So in the end, we got a statement that says inmates can work if they so desire, but it's not compulsory. But that is a compromise that we would not have had to make if we had an option to be able to put it directly on the ballot.
Yeah, and we have definitely seen that in other states as well. I mean, Florida comes to mind as a state where the threshold for passage is very high. It's 60%. And so to reach that threshold, you really have to work with folks of all different political ideologies to build a policy, build a pathway forward to be successful. So how did you both engage leaders across your state in the process of moving these measures forward, from the legislators to the policy wonks to grassroots organizations and advocates? Like, who was involved and how did you all build this process together?
So for us, because we had to go through the legislature first, we did it fairly quietly and just within the legislature. We did not go out and solicit a lot of public support. And so, and we felt that was necessary to get it passed. And so when we talk about it, we talk about how this is an issue that does unite people on the right and the left, because nobody is for slavery. And most people, when you talk about it, they assume that slavery has already been abolished. So we are able to talk about this issue in a way that shows that it's actually an issue that unites people. But the thing about it now is that we have not been able to build the grassroots support. People don't know about it. And so now, between now and November, we have to get the word out to the public and do all this education and movement building and mobilizing. And it seems rushed and at the last minute, but the process kind of forced us to do it that way.
Well, and it's a strategy choice, right? Of like,
yes.
Yes. At what point do you go big and loud with your efforts?
Yes.
To make sure that you're moving the needle on the issue, but then also not attracting unwanted attention that might spend big money against you.
Right.
Go ahead, Dre.
Yeah, and I think so. I think a lot of organizations, a lot of people, a lot of elected officials, they want community to engage, and they want community and people who are impacted to lead, but they don't actually know what that means. I'm not saying everyone, but because it's messy and it's more time consuming, it's complicated, it's nuanced. But like when we're actually centering workers who are most impacted, decision-making processes aren't just like who's the, policy person who knows best, right? We're asking our members as the experts of their own lives to make decisions and be involved. And as folks who are most impacted, that means they might not have access to transportation, childcare, all those kinds of things needed to engage in these meetings. And that's what it takes. And it's not easy. And for us, it's worth it though. Process really is as important as the outcome. And When people don't completely understand that, what ultimately happens is community gets cut out. They're not part of decision making. They're tokenized as people who have stories, and that's all. They don't have, any sense of what is feasible or possible or what is right. And that is really harmful. And that is what creates really harmful policies a lot of times that leave out people who ultimately are going to either benefit or not benefit, depending on how the policy turns out. And then, we did have to do a lot of information sessions around paid leave versus paid sick leave, or paid sick days. We also, I see 9 to 5 as filling the gap between our elected officials, the Capitol, Congress, and community, because a lot of folks feel like, oh, like the Capitol is for, certain people, which arguably, like there's definitely white supremacy, toxic culture in our Capitol, I'm sure, and a lot of them. But how do we democratize that process? How do we make people feel and know that is their space just as much as an elected official, that elected officials are there to serve, not to dictate. And so a lot of that process is not just talking about the policy itself, but how to engage in the process so people have the tools to feel really confident in their expertise in this whole process.
Yeah, that's such an important point of how we build these campaigns is so important. Here at BISC, we say it's just as important, if not even more important, than winning itself. Absolutely, we want to win, but how we build these campaigns, who is centered, what expertise is valued, the opportunity to build capacity, both skill sets and power for the future that is sustainable and that stays in the states and can continue to grow is very important. So thank you both for lifting that up. So how do we continue to build on these efforts, these policies, so we can continue moving forward even after winning a policy on the ballot?
So one of the things that happens, especially in the South, is that ballot measures and coalescing people around issues really brings people into the process in a way that candidates don't. Most candidates, especially now, they're just too politicized. But when we talk about our issues, our progressive issues, we all know that they are incredibly popular. We know this. And so when you can talk about an issue and bring issues directly to people, that mobilizes them, that gets them out to the polls, and it keeps them engaged because they see how that issue is impacting their lives. And they're going to watch how that issue develops and hold people accountable because of it.
I would say so. One of the reasons why ballot initiatives, I feel like, are just a very different tool, and especially if we're thinking about what's a transactional process versus a transformative process. And we do firmly believe that for deep, sustainable, permanent work, that's not rolled back as soon as a different party takes over. There has to be transformative relationships between elected officials, between community, between coalition members. Because when things are more transactional, when it comes to implementation, for example, there's not that community there that's like, okay, we're going to go out, make sure everyone knows their rights. Or if there's an attack, everyone's kind of left because it's like, well, we had the policy win. We're not looking out to do the defense work. And so, if we think about the lifespan of a policy, it's much longer than, the introduction or when it's placed on the ballot to when it passes. And so if we don't have that transformative commitment to our community and to each other, then those policies will either get watered down or rolled back, or people won't even know about these wins. And then what's the point of passing these policies? And I do think having the chance to go out in community and politicize our folks through ballot initiatives. And like Theeda was saying, proving that this is not, partisan issue, this is bipartisan issue. Both sides of the aisle are voting on this. Then we can really build a narrative around, basic human rights. What do we all deserve to have in order to survive, and not just politicizing, who gets to have what. Like, we all deserve these things. And so I think, I want to continue to build off of that momentum and that politicization, so that people also feel more invested and engaged and valued in this whole process of passing laws.
Yeah, and to your point, that's how they stay. It's how they stay engaged, right? And Dre, I know we're coming up on time here, but if you could just spend like a minute talking a little bit about the implementation process for Colorado for paid family leave, because I think that's a piece of this puzzle that folks often don't think about at the beginning. Is not only do we want to win this, but we got to make sure it's implemented and people know about it. So can you just talk a little bit about the work that you all did around that?
Yeah, so we were very firmly committed to the implementation process after passage. There's rules and regulations which actually determine how people access a program. It can grow or shrink who actually has access. It's very, even though the ballot initiative itself is very strong, these types of pieces can dwindle it down in a lot of different ways without people knowing, because the rules and regulations process is very long, very tedious. It just keeps going and going. You're like, oh, it's done. No, it's not done. It just keeps going. And so being part of that is really important. And just recognizing that when we don't do our due diligence of enforcement, of implementation, of educating people about how to access a program and their rights, we're basically just perpetuating systems of oppression and privilege and who gets access to different programs because of they speak English, because of their access, their proximity to power, to education. And so if we're not doing that, really, like, what are we doing? We're really just perpetuating these systems that we're supposedly fighting against. And I don't, what's the point of passing a policy that's not enforced? There's none, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, it's the whole 360 life cycle of a ballot measure, from the moment you have the conception and incubation all the way through implementation, and they build on each other and support each other through each phase. So thank you both for lifting that up. With our last few minutes, wanted to give you the opportunity to lift up anything you'd like folks to know, or anything we didn't cover that you want folks who are considering ballot measures, whether they're legislatively referred or citizen initiated, to take into consideration?
To really study what's going on, because one of the things that is tripping us up now, and we just discovered it now that we're trying to get people out to vote, is how they count the votes on constitutional amendments. They count them by who the majority of the votes of people who voted in the gubernatorial race. So instead of counting the majority of people who voted, period, they counted by the number of people who voted in the gubernatorial race. So they're tying the success of this constitutional amendment to the number to a candidate race. And we did not know that from the beginning, and we're just finding that out now. And so now we have to educate the entire state that if you want to vote for this amendment, if you want your vote to count, you have to vote in the governor's race. So that's just another burden of education that we have to get out there and carry, and another barrier.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky to be in Colorado, because it is a very, very different game in terms of who has access to this process. So a couple things I would say, and I think some people saw Colorado's win and said, oh, we just need to drop $7 million into a state, and then a ballot initiative will pass. And I just want to make it very clear that it was the 10 years of grassroots organizing, of public will building, of building a narrative and a public need for demand for this program that led to the like seemingly easy passage, because it was during COVID. We actually, couldn't really door knock, which is our bread and butter, and like, what we use, the tool we use to build meaningful relationships. But it's because we did the groundwork ahead of time that really passed that. And so even though it didn't pass through the legislature those 6 times, it wasn't done in vain. It still really built the momentum needed so that when the ballot initiative came, people already knew what that meant. And then the other thing I'll just say is that, just as an example to show why implementation and just being very vigilant throughout the whole process after passage is important, our Colorado Department of Labor, we found out through a Open Records Act request that they were attempting to privatize basically the process of claims and benefits and giving out benefits, which is the worst part to privatize, arguably. And they hadn't really involved us, even though we had had a good relationship with them. And so we quickly mobilized, we started sending a letter around, and then they backed down. And if you ask Connecticut, if you ask other states who passed paid leave, that is very common of privatizing different parts of the program. But if we weren't vigilant, if we weren't there and still organizing, that probably would have passed and undermined years, literally 10 years of work we built to make this program as accessible as possible.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences, your expertise with the attendees here today. For folks that were watching the chat, I did put BISC's email in there. So if folks have more questions about ballot measures, please reach out to us, and happy to also connect you with folks who are doing this work. So it looks like DPN just put in the chat for folks to, after this wraps up, to click on the session tab on the left to join one of our 2 panels up next at the half hour: social housing in my backyard and non-carceral first responders. So thanks all for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.